Hello. So, part 3. And part 3 is an interesting one. It's the non-Churchillian crackpot schemes. Barring the Battle Atlantic. That's not going to be included because I have a feeling both the redo and the original will generate enough comments in themselves that I will have to do another one of these for those. And also, it's kind of unfair considering the rest have had a couple of days, at least, to generate comments. And those will have just gone up today and tomorrow. Although today, when this comes out. In fact, it will go out after this one goes up. So, that's a brain tweezer. It really is. So, without much further ado, let's go to the first of them, which is the Battle of the Bull Run. I think, if it works. Yes, the Battle of Bull Run. And it did work. Well, hey. So, Bull Run is... Well, it's kind of interesting, some of the comments which came through on this one. I was honestly expecting there to be less, because I thought it was sort of... People would go, oh, this is supposed to be a naval channel. But yeah, you got into it, you enjoyed it, and thank you to everyone who watched it. Hieroglyph. Battle of Bull Run. I say a run is a body of water. Sure, there must be some warships in here. And so here we are. Not quite. It's a shame there weren't. It could have been quite interesting if there had been some warships. Tab. Wow, this is different. Just got done watching the 60-minute video on Grant's Vicksburg campaign too. That did involve a Navy. Talk about coincidence. Paul from Chicago. That wasn't Crackpot though. Simon Thompson, lol. Jack NFL put out the US River Ironclads video of a man from Louisiana. Tab. Yeah, I watched that earlier. Maybe it started a trend, but what I watched yesterday was from the present Lincoln Library and Museum. I had no idea what Drac was doing, so honestly, it was entirely coincidental. It's Ken Barb. Chicago. Actually, kind of thinking, to the skeptical outside observer, a lot of things that we tried to approach Vicksburg before the final thing that worked, running the gunships and transports past Vicksburg and at night and using them to transport the troops across the river further downstream, probably looked like crackpot ideas. Digging a canal up across the hairpin, using some of the small rivers and slough sticks. There's all sorts of options. Wayne Boring, 50 teenagers. Oh, you poor guy. And you'll get home feeling like a limp dish bag. You've heard the voice. It's been shouting a lot. Mainly, to be honest, because you need to project once they start playing basketball, etc., to get them inside. You may have gone overtime, but it was worth every second. I love your talks. I'm glad you did. How about a discussion of the Channel Patrols, where HMCS Azkaban was lost? I know that Roger Hill, writing in the book Destroyer Captain, has discussed at how the ops were carried out. There are certain times I have time for Roger Hill, and there are other times where I think possibly his own knowledge becomes a hamper. I would have to say, on terms of the ops and how they were carried out in the channel, they were still developing a lot of techniques. Even then. And a lot of the stuff that is taken for granted post-war, even into the 1950s and the 60s, was still being developed in 1944-45. And when you're developing stuff, you make mistakes. And the enemy gets a vote. And sometimes they get lucky. That's the truth in war. There is, whenever someone starts talking about the science of war to me, and starts going, yes, 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 this is all scientific, mathematical. There's a hierarchy of needs and a threat bottom matrix, and everything fits in there nice and neatly, and we can work out what we do to deal with this threat matrix and this point in the threat matrix. I sit there and go, does the enemy work out their stuff according to the same threat matrix box as you do? Do they think the same way as you do? Are you sure you understand their capabilities 100%? Or do you factor in a level of misunderstanding, of incomprehension, of unknown unknowns? Because I'm sure probability there is probably some massively long equations out there going into it, but in the end, nope. I'm not too trusting of it. I think it's useful to an extent. And I think all wars and all experience will eventually features in, but eventually you're going to take risks, and some of them will pan out, and some of them won't. And sometimes the opponent will get lucky. Admiral BT. I'm surprised you're still commenting on this channel and not running away, and not just sending death emojis at me. All the things I say about BT. Excellent. Used to live on the edge of the battlefields. First and second Bull Run. Interested to hear your view on the battles. Hieroglyph. Each side thought the other would just give up. Underestimation of the importance of training and logistics. These are classic errors which reoccur in war after war. I presume it's the fault of civilian politicians who have little or usually no, military training experience and blithely imagine negotiated compromises. While negotiations and compromises are ordinary in peace, they are not too existent in war. I've no good examples of negotiated peace or compromise agreements leading to war termination. Wars are easy to start and impossible to finish, as well as unpredictable in their course, because they're agnostic. Well, I don't think you mean agnostic. I think you mean agonist. Agonistic conflicts in which neither side can compromise or surrender, and so they are fought to the death and total defeat of one side or the other. Okay, hieroglyph. That's definitely not new, because I'm fairly certain by the way that it comes up as your name. English is not your first language, so that's me trying to interpret what you're writing. Antagonistic, I think, is a conflict. Yeah. One, even if the Union took Richmond, the war would have gone on. Not for as long. Likewise, if the Union took Washington, the war would have gone on. I think you mean Confederacy took Washington. The war would have gone on. Yes, and probably a lot quicker, because just imagine the amount of politicians Lincoln could have got rid of in one fell swoop by leaving them in Washington. Oh, that'd been fun. Alias 72. Negotiated peace was far more common prior to the middle of the 19th century, where the widespread inclusion of the civilian population, in fact, if not even in law, into the political process made such negotiations untenable. I.e., when leaders could just write off sections of the population. This became evident in the First World War, where, by historical precedent, the German Empire should have been able to secure a negotiated settlement by 1916. The losses incurred by the French people only strengthened their commitment to the conflict, ensuring a fight to the bitter end. Compare this to the current Middle East, where Western nations have accepted defeats. The losses to Western forces were minor, and populists showed no investment in continuing the conflict, making withdrawal politically possible. The more you hurt the people and a government of a modern country, the more committed that country becomes in its opposition to you. This holds true because most people consider their own nation to be more legitimate than their opponents in war. They will view destruction of their property, their country, and their countrymen's lives as unforgivable and resist. Another example of this is the Franco-Prussian War, where Emperor Napoleon III was willing to surrender after 2 weeks and destruction of the standing army. Despite this weak position, this left France in, the civilian government continued to resist for months and had to be battered into submission. None of this was obvious by the time of the Civil War, and so it's forgivable that leaders at the time tried to be ignorant of this. To an extent, I would definitely agree with that. It's also something which I think politicians forget to this day. Hieroglyph, alias 72, thank you for your thoughtful, well-considered and considerate reply. Ditto. Aesthetic Studios, today, to be extra fair to the Union, the wars of Italian unification and countless other liberal nationalist uprisings in Europe have been put down within the last few decades by existing standing armies very easily. It's possible to see how the North could have underestimated what they saw as a regional rebellion just by comparing it to all the failed revolutions in Europe in this time period. Paragraph. Later text serious. Literally half of the entire country declared secession. This was actually much bigger than the Boston Rebellion of 1774, which one could easily have seen as a sign of how easy or difficult the coming war would be. Half the country may be in terms of territory, not in population. The Union's population was far bigger than the Confederacy's. John Culver, your eyebrow looks rather dignified in Tumblr. I guess I'll have to go shopping soon. It does look dignified in Tumblr, but I rather like it in a Stein. You have more. Stephen McCaskey. Finally, been setting up this battle up in the extra bedroom to Wargrain. You have an extra bedroom. Cool. Got hung up doing research. Yes, maps are beautiful, but you need to know rather intimately what they represent. Reminds me of a couple of years back, I went to Gettysburg once again. People often say Ewell should have attacked Culp's Hill when Lee suggested it. Good thing he didn't. My curiosity, having once again gotten the better of me, drove the 1,000+ miles to check out the ground. Arrived a week or so before the actual ban anniversary, so the ground was much like it would have been like then. Very deceiving, even when right there. Wooded, but not too densely, with a beautiful green carpet of new growth field grass, about 1.5 to 2 foot tall, gently rising towards the hill itself. Beautiful, serene. Try walking it. Beneath that lush green beauty, at almost every step was a hidden branch or bow. If not that it was hidden rocks, ideal to twist or break your ankle on. I walked 3 V patterns towards the hill. Center left, center right. It was all like that. I can't imagine even small, loosely formed units not looking like a drunken mass of Three Stooges trying to get to that hill. And all the while being shot at in the fading light from the Union troops who had some excellent rock formations providing great cover. I mean, it was kind of silly. Looked like they were specifically designed for just such a purpose. An assault there and then would have mirrored Pickett's charge, except beneath trees. Maps are great in books and pretty on walls, but some very disgruntled emojis. Yeah, that's the problem with a lot of maps. They look good on maps, they look good on paper. It doesn't work that well in reality. Steve Winnish, great points about NCOs mostly going Union. It would be a real advantage. A strong cadre can be more important than raw numbers or a large but inexperienced officer corps. West Point rich boys? Who cares if they go success? We got the sergeants and the quartermasters. What I always remembered from the battle is that the strange absurdity of the Zouaves. The proof that fashion sometimes trumps military reason. These guys spend a fortune on their outfits and wore them in battle, sometimes provided by wealthy senior officers. In the pictures, I look around next to them for the organ grinding monkey. Don't get me started on Zouaves. Nosdummer, 50 or so teenagers. Can't see where this is going on. So it goes wrong. So is one of the teams named Murphy? No, none of them were named Murphy. Most of them in the second week were averaging about 14, 15 years of age. So I might now have more grey hair. There were pictures posted on Twitter of some of the stuff we got up to, and Justin Craig Education will be posting more pictures at some point on, once they've sorted out people's permissions. So again, pretty much all military actions are both crackpot schemes and good ideas badly executed. Categorize Hannibal's elephants through the Alps. Which category does that one fit in? Well, it's a good idea, well executed, because he gets them through the Alps. But once they're in Italy, it's kind of the invasion itself is a bit of a crackpot scheme, because it's a fundamental misreading of Rome, and, well, I can get into it. I'll do a thing about Hannibal's invasion. I might do that in an extended version of crackpot schemes. Simon Thompson, just watched an in-depth video on the Battle of Antium. I would argue McClellan did not get as much from his army in September of 1862 as McDowell had from his in July 1861. I would agree, but McClellan is a... Let's put it this way, there aren't many officers, general or admiral otherwise, who I would rate as lowly as I rate McClellan. There aren't many at all. The piecemeal deployment inability to achieve a decisive victory at Antium, where McClellan had a copy of Lee's battle plan and a nearly 2-to-1 advantage in soldiers. McClellan was nobody's skilled battlefield commander. Nope. Grace Carmichael. I have an ex that lived in Manassas. Manassas. She would be interested in this. And there's a very interesting poem, I think, there. Andrew Sizzle, an overgrown teenager in charge of 50 or so actual teenagers. What could possibly go wrong? As I typed this, Back in Black just started playing on the radio. Well, I'm glad about the choice of music on the radio. I'm not sure about the overgrown teenager one. I suppose sometimes on here I am, but no. I like Justin Craig Education. I've worked for them as a tutor for roughly 13 years, I think. It must be somewhere in the region of that. And I've worked for them as a course director. I've been doing that for them for about 10 years. Roughly. And I enjoy it. I enjoy going and working with teenagers, school kids. You get actually quite a good mix of both kids from parents who are really striving to try and make education the silver bullet, and kids from schools you wouldn't expect would still need extra, would still want or need extra support, but who feel they do, so come along, and all sorts of ranges in between, and it's fun. It's a fun mix. It's fun to work with them. No other times do I get to play as many basketball games, as many rugby games, as many games of Articulate as I do when I'm on those courses. I also usually tend to have a chess game going. One of my tricks is to have a secret chess game going. So I'm moving one side, and I just see if any of the students pick it up. And then I make the moves during lesson times when they're not there, when they're not there. So they don't know who they're playing against, which of the staff or which people they're playing against, and they start and see if they move. You can do all sorts of fun things to, it spark their imaginations and make them think, and help them with their university choices or what they want to do with life. As to Crow, how many requests some videos to be filmed outdoors when away from home? You are so blessed with actual green in the UK. Those of us in Outback Australia would like to see and dream. If I get a chance and a home, I will do. And I will do. I will film some in the garden at some point for you. I'm just thinking, the Confederate expecting Union just to roll over and accept defeat reminds me a lot of how Japan expects America to just roll over and expect defeat. Makes me wonder just how much of American history the Japanese leadership actually knew. To be fair, I'm quite sure American leadership in World War II wasn't all that familiar with Japanese history either. You are right on both counts. Martin Howe. Took a while for the penny to drop this video. I started off thinking, how was Churchill responsible for this one? Bill Bond, same here. I I could have tried. Which is great. Glad to see you're doing more of these. Thanks. I'm glad I did more of them. I felt it was quite fun. Nicole Ross, isn't 50 teenagers behaving another crackpot scheme? My response to that was they're good kids, but let me answer after we do tonight's fire pit. I can answer about tonight's that fire pit. It went well. We did 2 fire pits each week. I had some kids come and help me set up the fires. Then we lit them, and then after we got through the initial burning stage, the rest of the kids came down, made s'mores. Didn't sing campfire songs because, frankly, all the music they like to listen to does not go with campfire singing. So they just put on some music and chatted, and the tutors chatted, and they had looked at the stars. And at some point, I think I explained about the fact that when you look up, you are literally looking into the past because the light takes so long to reach Earth that when you stare up, are literally staring back in time at planets and stars. But honestly, once I start explaining about the planets, they just sort of look a bit funny at me. So yeah, I have a hand over to the physics master, or I am. Just tell them to go back, do it. Some pay attention and come talking afterwards. Most just want to have fun and chat with people at HR. Enjoy the fact that outside you don't have to have a mask on. And let's see. Ooh, and next topic at 22-minute mark. It's the Maginot Line. Yes, it's the Maginot Line. Always interesting to get to. Now, the Maginot Line, this actually got a lot of you talking and thinking. And it was interesting that it came up. And to me, it was sort of a natural extension of the work I've done on Welsh castles and the things I plan to do on Cornish castles when I get a chance. Jay the Happy Wyvern definitely liked to comment on this one. I got to visit one of the Maginot bunkers near Strasbourg while on vacation and got to turn one of the gun turrets they still had there. It was a lot of fun to see the conditions of them and the men stationed there would have been having to deal with. Cool times. Me and Drac did something similar in Jersey with some of the World War II fortifications there. Bill Bond, the Maginot Line meant if it was avoided by aggressive Germany, it would bring in other parties, Belgium at least. Other parties were already involved by the time of the German invasion. True. And Robiti. Carrier battle groups, America's Maginot Line? To an extent, if a full carrier battle group is capable of dominating an area of water and therefore turn it into an impassable barrier, yeah, that's a sort of Maginot Line that you can draw in the Pacific and Atlantic. Well, from Chicago, the Maginot Line did its job. The French leadership did not. Dope Squad. I'd say that's the best one-line summary. The French leadership, both civilian and military, made decisions that meant the Maginot Line worked against instead of for the defense of France. 100% agreed. Sea dollars. Would the French economy and willingness to spend on their defence allow the Maginot Line to be extended along the Belgian border? Gildar. Afik? The terrain along the border wasn't suitable for a line of fortification. The original plan was for Belgium to build its own defence line on more suitable ground in Belgium, and in wartime the French army would move into Belgium to support the defence. In the early 30s, when construction of Maginot Line started, there was a defence treaty between Belgium and France. But that fell apart in 1936 after the French did little to stop the German remilitarisation of the Rhineland. So in 1940, the French were not allowed to move into Belgium unless Germany invaded first. But with a head start, the Germans had plenty of time to overrun the fortifications along the Belgian-German border. Dope Squad. The French economy would have not been able to support the building extension of the Maginot Line to the coast. And had the French government been willing to abandon Belgium and Netherlands to German aggression, defence spending would have been made available. No, the French economy would have been able to support building the extension of the Maginot Line to coast. And had the French government been willing to abandon Belgium and the Netherlands to German aggression, defence spending would have been made available. However, the terrain wasn't as suitable as that of Alsace-Lorraine for a string of fortifications like Maginot. So likely it would take in the form of heavily built blockhouses and pillboxes rather than the subterranean fortresses of the Maginot Line. The plan was for Belgium and the Netherlands to fortify the river, Meuse, and in doing so, along the Maginot Line, create a line of forts from the Swiss mountains to the coast in order to halt a German attack. Sounds like a great idea if you're France, as France is entirely defended. If you're Belgium and Netherlands, it's not so great, as all the devastation of the ground war will be inflicted upon your population and infrastructure. France built their section of the plan, but didn't modify the fortification plan in light of the Belgian Dutch reluctance. It said they planned to get to the Meuse before the German forces could. This was a bad plan, but almost worked, mainly due to German logistics being so bad it took them 3 days to get the vanguard divisions of their attack out of Germany. This was because their divisions still depended upon horses for a lot of their logistics. The only motorized and mechanized army, a fully motorized, mechanized army in the world at the time was the British one. And they don't get any credit for it. But there again, they do behave slightly nuttily. The failure was not predicting the attack through the Ardennes. As Dr. Clark said, it should have been seen as a possibility, and to an extent was. But the forces placed to defend the Ardennes were those ranked as the lowest level of combat readiness in the French army, and not facing the German panzer divisions. We need at least one decent division there. And this is going to sound strange, but you can see on this plan that there is weak fortifications put along there, and strong fortifications. In the nicest way, put a double line of weak fortifications then, if you're going to be defending on blockhouses and those sort of things. But actually have them sticking along there. And have them there. Have a second line. So if your initial forces at the front do get over, they have some place to withdraw to, and something to reinforce. Both the Allies and the Germans were taken massively by surprise by the success of Rommel in the Ardennes. The Allies didn't think it possible to move through the Ardennes with armour at the speed Rommel managed due to small roads and limited routes, but that assumption had been based on an attack towards Paris, where the infrastructure would have worked against Rommel. The attack towards the coast meant the German army was able to use the infrastructure built in the region in the interwar years. This meant that the Allied assumptions about the speed of advance in the region were a massive underestimation of the speeds that Rommel was able to achieve. Those speeds and the depth of the advance took the German command by surprise as well. The German High Command predicted that the Panzer's initial advance would cause a shock to the Allies and act as a diversion, drawing forces away from the main route of advance across the Belgian plains. The standing orders were for the Panzer units to be absorbed into the command structure of the infantry divisions as soon as the infantry caught up with the Panzers, that were expected to be halted by the forces diverted to meet them. The Germans never expected the Panzer divisions to get as far ahead of the following infantry divisions as they did. Overall, the Maginot Line worked exactly as intended. Unfortunately, the French government, through bad diplomacy and paranoia about the army wanting to overthrow them, undermined the rest of Maginot's plan, and making the success of the Maginot Line work against, not for, France's defence. Agreed. Line hard X-ray. When you funnel the enemy and force them to attack a certain area, you shouldn't be surprised that they attack you in the area you force them to attack. Thus, the Allies weren't surprised by the attack through Belgium. They had planned for that and set in motion that plan. Hence, the best units of the British and French armies rushed into Belgium to meet the German advance. What they didn't expect was a west-northwest advance through the Ardennes. They had considered a southwest advance through the Ardennes, but correctly surmised that wasn't feasible due to rivers and steep valleys that even now make a north-south trip faster around the Ardennes than through it. Even the Germans had thought the Rommel's division would only act as a diversion, drawing forces away from the main advance into Belgium. The Maginot Line worked perfectly, but due to decisions made by civilian and military leadership in France that harmed rather than helped the defence of France. Sarek, that's good. Also, don't forget Belgian foreign policy and defence agreements doing a total 180 in the mid-late 1930s, forcing basically all the original planning to be withdrawn. That's good, Sarek. In 1936, France and Britain refused to enforce the demilitarization of the Rhineland, suggesting to the Belgian government that the two major European powers were not serious about containing German expansion and that Belgium would have to fend for itself. The fates of Austria and Czechoslovakia would seem to prove them right on that. Belgium and Netherlands withdrew from the defence agreement and looked to their own defence as the French enforcement of the demilitarization of Rhineland was an integral part of the agreement. Therefore, the Belgian and Dutch government's change in defence policy was not unforeseen or unpredictable, rather a direct result of the decisions of the French civilian leadership undermining Maginot Plan almost as soon as the infrastructure it called for had been completed. Sadly true. Decisive, I always consider it a good idea. The main purpose was to stop Germans passing through Alsace-Lorraine. They did not pass Alsace-Lorraine, ergo it worked. To be honest, I think the expectation that Belgium wouldn't muck it up didn't help, as they went on and mucked it up. If the French and British forces secure and in better positions in Belgium, they'd be in much better positions. Ardennes for us would have still been a big threat, but much more manageable in theory, even considering real-world performances. Not extending the line to the coast had many reasons, geopolitical and financial being big ones. In real life, Belgium was arguably supposed to have built the extension in its lands, but only built a couple. Built by Germany. That's good. French asked the Belgians and Dutch governments to build a line of fortifications that wouldn't defend either Belgium nor the Netherlands, would subject both to being the battleground of a war between great powers, and was somehow surprised when the Belgians and Dutch governments weren't too keen on the plan. I agree, and as said, it'd be quite interesting if the French had built hard fortifications the whole way along their border, and had just built them all round the borders of France. So all the way around with Germany and the north, built some form of fortifications around probably Switzerland and Italy, just to continue it on, and on their border with Spain. If they just built it with everyone, then no one could have complained, because they just said, we're securing our borders, this is how we're doing it. And they could have then not worried about their army, because it would have all been posted on the edges. And that would have been fun. A very high-tech version of World War One would probably resulted, or at least a blunting of any German attacks for initially. Wayne Boren, and when the Poles asked for help pre-war, they got very little. Of course. How were they going to help the Polish? This is what I always ask people. The guarantee of Poland is lovely and morally correct. Strategically, it's pointless because you can't actually do anything. The only ones who could do something was the Soviet Union, and no one really wanted to ask them to do it because everyone knew their help came with very big ruble signs in terms of requests. Carmen Gazbeg, fortifications buy time and make them bleed. True. Gilda, in real life, IRC, the forests of the Ardennes did their part to slow down the German advance. The few roads did not allow for rapid movements of many troops. So one German soldier literally said, historians may call it blitzkrieg, but for me it was one big traffic jam. That's what the roads that existed mainly went east to west instead of north to south. The Allies had assumed that any German attack would be towards Paris, and therefore the Ardennes would be suitable due to the combination of rivers and steep valleys. It wouldn't be suitable due to the combination of rivers and steep valleys that even now make north-south trip faster around and through the Ardennes. There was a massive traffic jam, but that was mainly within Germany. The routes from the staging areas to the departure points were very busy, with several divisions that are meant to be taking objectives in Belgium on day one still being stuck in Germany on the morning of day 3. This turned out to be massively advantageous for the Germans, as it allowed time for the Allied forces to get into Belgium, where they were subsequently surrounded by the advance through the Ardennes. If there hadn't been delays, the French and British armies wouldn't have been cut off, and the Germans would have had to face them on the Belgian plains, probably resulting in the German advance being halted in southwestern Belgium. True. Adrian J. Maginot Line did its job. Yep. Doug M. If the French hadn't stationed the forces and supported them like the plans called for behind the Belgies, had stationed the forces and supported them like the plans called for behind the Belgies, things would have been very good. Had a very good chance of working. That's good. The plan called for the French and British armies to rush into Belgium and help the Belgian army hold the Meuse River. This was behind the initial front line of the Belgian army that held the German advance as far along neither side had anticipated before engaging in a fighting withdrawal towards the Meuse. The plan was a good one, save for the placing of low combat readiness troops in the Ardennes. The region has many rivers and steep valleys that make north-south travel in the region slow. Even today, it is quicker to go round than through the region going north or south. The Allies hadn't... That squad seems to have been copying and pasting this one. The Allies hadn't considered the German advance towards the northwest through the Ardennes because, whilst the infrastructure and geography is significantly better for the advance in that direction, it didn't lead to any objective not better reached by an advance over the Belgian plains. Therefore, low combat readiness troops were posted there to go through some rapid training in an area that was meant to be quiet. These troops reached the area before any of their heavy equipment and were quickly attacked by Rommel's tank divisions. They held the line even after their command staff had retreated without orders, taking artillery and support companies with them. The men on the front line only retreated when they were almost out of ammunition, and it had become obvious they weren't going to be being reinforced. They were good troops. They tried their best. Jonathan Nolle. The Maginot Line worked perfectly, did exactly what it was designed to do, which was delaying and diverting the German forces. The problem is that the French, the Belgians, and the BAF didn't get their collective stuff together to coordinate an effective campaign into the north of the Maginot Line. Agar 1. The British and French could not, literally. The entire defensive plan behind the Maginot Line required the British and French troops to enter Belgium prior to or just after the German troops crossed the Belgian border in order to give the British and French time to get to the rivers that were to anchor their defence. When the Maginot Line was being built, France and Belgium had a treaty allowing the French troops to enter as soon as war was declared. Before German troops crossed the border, however, that treaty fell apart before the war. As a result, British and French troops were unable to enter Belgium until Germany had invaded it. The problem here is that one does not give an order to 20-odd divisions and then spring immediately into action. It takes time for those divisions to get moving. By the time the British and French could move, it was already too late and the rivers had been crossed at several points before the British and French forces were able to reach them. Also, the British and French were not doing badly in the north. Things did not start falling apart until the attack through the Ardennes and the fall of Sedan, which was not in the northern sector. This cut the British and French mobile armies in the north off from the rest of the French army, leaving the commanders of the mobile forces no choice but to retreat to the sea. It was either that or become surrounded and cut off from all possible supply and then be ground into dogmeat in Kesselneck. Ben Wilson. Agar. Thank you, well put. The sudden surrender of Belgium without informing their allies was another Belgian failure. As you know, pretty sure Belgium abandoned the plan just prior to the invasion by denying access to Allied forces so they could stay neutral. Carrick, student aviator, that mostly. All prior agreements broke down in the late 30s. Basically, the entire scheme had to be redrawn from scratch. To my knowledge, the original plan was to fortify Belgium as well, before they did 180 and demanded that they should be neutral instead. Well, if they want to be neutral, the nicest way, the only way to do that will be for them to put fortifications on all their borders. This is what they should have been doing. They should have been building more fortifications. If Belgium, Netherlands, France had put fortifications around all their borders, it would have been a nightmare for Germany. It really would have been. Just imagine it, just a ring of fortifications all over Europe in the 1920s and 30s, building concrete fortifications. The forts of the Belgian and the French side would be staring at each other, and both would be staring into Alsace-Lorraine going, who's going to move first? John Evans. The key fault is the failure to maintain Belgium as an ally rather than adopting policy of neutrality, then leaving your prepared positions compound it. Just leave the Belgians to their decision. True. Sean Mack. That and Brenda variant, that and the Breda variant of the Dial plan. John Evans. Mack. Who needs a mobile reserve that would have otherwise been well placed to counter the sickle cut through the Sedan? Yeah. John Evans. That's a small glass for iron brewers at single malt. I guess Diamond Day suggests not a malt. No, it wasn't a malt. Patrick Clayton, is it true you cannot wargame France May, June 1940 as no human is as idiotic as the French High Command? The French High Command, believe it or not, were humans. You can wargame it, you can follow them, but most people start to question the script quite early on. John Hart, the Maginot Line did its job. The French military doctrine didn't. Agnew, thoughts are not crackpot, but politicians tend to presume they deter and repel with 100% effectiveness, and even when they fail to repel, they still tout these immobile positions, which are thus outmaneuvered and rendered irrelevant. Whether it's Fortress Singapore or Fortress Europa, Pillow Fort is better. Again, I have covered Singapore. So could have been held. They planned for the last war, which is such a common error, so they expected a 3 to 5 mile per hour and they got a 30 mile per hour war. Again, think about this plan, okay? Let's look at this map. As you can see, there are some fairly solid positions. You've got Luxembourg, you've got a bit of Liège there, sort of Belgium, all these things, where you're supposed to have the Maginot Line and other systems. Now, let's say you carry on the hard fortifications till it's past the river Sambra, or Samba, which you can see Namur is on, but Samba itself is the one which is the more northerly of the two rivers which go through Namur. So if you'd carried it all the way there, you would have covered a huge section of the Meuse. You wouldn't even have gone right to the sea. You'd have just given yourself strategic depth. And any attack through the Ardennes, forest, etc., would have run into solid fortification. And actually, that territory you could do. It wouldn't be cheap, but it's cheaper than losing an entire war. And this is really the point of what's being missed. When they're making the Maginot Line, they are spending a lot of money. And yet, they're building a line based on weak fortifications and strong fortifications. And the strong fortifications cover, well, they've got them covering Luxembourg, but for some reason, not the part of Belgium. And if you're going to be depending on the Meuse to defend yourself, you'd better make sure you at least get to the Meuse yourself. Ideally, you go further than the Meuse. You give yourself some depth. As I said, the Meuse River is the other one going through Namur. You see that, and that's the one which comes down here. So the French, the line of fortifications, of strong fortifications, doesn't even reach the Meuse where it goes into France. This is the point. It's badly executed in many ways. They needed to have more of the hard fortifications, the strong fortifications, and I would have argued if you're going to have a line of weak fortifications, then you need at least 2 lines of weak fortifications. And I would argue also that the weak fortifications should overlap the strong fortifications, so you turn the point where it turns from strong into weak into a very strong area, rather than a random transition. So people can't just poke around the strong fortifications. So, yeah. It's badly executed on several levels. Thomas Rockwell, another complicating factor in the Maginot Line was air power, or in France's case, the lack thereof. The Luftwaffe was able, when it came to the big push, to bring concentration of force to bear when it was needed. French air assets were too dispersed. Many fighters were reserved for defending cities deep in France. Many were obsolete and in the process of being replaced. Communications were poor and lacking radar. There was no way to vector in interceptors to attack incoming bombers. Equally, without air superiority, the French were unable to deploy their recon planes and therefore had difficulty knowing where the enemy was. A lack of decent ground attack planes didn't help either. For a strategy that required rapid deployment of forces to scan their enemy, this was, if not fatal, a contributing cause of the failure of the Maginot strategy. I would say it's more a failure of deployment than a failure of actual aircraft, because the French do actually have some very good aircraft. They just had them badly positioned, and you don't hear much about them in World War II because, well, they stopped fighting in World War II rather early. But they do have some good aircraft. In fact, their fighter, Interceptor in World War II, was probably one of the better initial designs in 1939. Hieroglyph. Stumps are still vehicular obstacles. Chainsaws are not a breakthrough technology. Tracked vehicles moving rapidly over trails, however. Yes, but you can widen roads quite quickly, and that's important. You can make the space for you to move through those vehicles. Hieroglyph. France, in fact, had enough tanks and supporting vehicles to form at least 2 tank corps. What they lacked was a coherent doctrine and radios. Just admit you're here for land cruisers. Land ships, yes. Hieroglyph. Sir, it was so fast. A surprise was so fast. This battle illustrates the failure of collective security, the failure of deterrence, and limitations of forts, e.g. see Emin and Mal. It also illustrates the problems of the Rue fighting last war. Alliance cohesion, Anglo-French cooperation sucked. More, the British were surprised at how few radios the French had and how their forces were not really trained up to use them. There should have been some more exercises between the armies in the interwar period, but there hadn't been. The importance of correct cohesive military doctrine, Belgeskrieg, or as just doctrine, the importance of recognizing and exploiting technology. Why do people actually tend to just use the German words as if that is? I don't mean you're doing this, but some people just use the German words as if the Germans are the only ones who have this. Lots of nations had it. The Americans, the British, lots of nations have cohesive military doctrine. Actually implementing it tends to depend on a lot of contextual and political factors, as well as operational ones, because the militaries don't tend to operate in a vacuum. They have a doctrine which they develop, and then it's to their politicians to allow them to implement it. The importance of recognizing and exploiting new technologies, viruses, space weapons, hypersonic rockets, drones, AI, and the dangers that dictatorships pose to democracies. Gosh, does this battle have warnings for age? Because the inherently unstable dictators need nice foreign wars to distract their populace, and thus are willing to launch surprise attacks using the latest technologies in a coherent, concentrated, violent attack. Not staring at Taiwan and wishing we had air bases there, complete with a few squadrons of NATO aircraft. I'd say be careful what you wish for on those fronts. And I would also say that it's be careful reading too many lessons into these things, because what you're dealing with is not the same necessarily as what you think you're dealing with. There have been interesting conflicts with drones recently. There have been interesting conflicts with all these things. But with viruses, well, if you have a very competent and secure computer department aboard your ship, etc., or a warship, and you air gap your vital systems, it's theoretically quite difficult for viruses to get in there. Space-based weaponry? Well, technically that's illegal, but who knows? Hypersonic rockets. They're coming in, but, and I say this with the nicest intentions, hypersonic rockets for me suffer from a similar issue as, let's say, anti-ship ballistic missiles. You have to be very sure about your target's position for you to use them, or you have to put a very big warhead on them. Because they're moving so fast that if they're off by even a small margin, they will go a long way away. As for drones and AI, well, true AI requires a lot of processing power. A lot of processing power. And we're talking quantum computing. And getting those stable and running is a difficult thing. Drones are interesting, though. Drones are interesting. But it's technologies, there are always lots of technologies, but it's judging when they mature. Okay, Steve Wish. Steve Windish. It worked too well, thus didn't work at all. By the time it was well and truly flanked and useless, there were 20 divisions stuck there with nothing left to do but surrender, very few of them being motorized or even mobile, and losing its strategic importance was worse for morale than the sinking of all the battleships it once would have been. That, along with the communist propaganda working for surrender, and the horrible leadership and poor communications, sunk France. They could have counter-flooded, They could have patched and shored up and put out the fires. They were convinced it was hopeless and abandoned ship instead. Algar. True, but bear in mind that most of those 20 divisions were the lowest quality divisions in the French army. Thus, were not really of much use doing anything but manning static defences. That's what they really structured around. Again, Sambre River. At least. Give yourself some strategic depth. And also that means in the nicest way, anyone cutting through the Ardennes forest, even east-west, just isn't going to go through. Jim the First. Jim I. France had superior tanks, but Germans had radio coordination. The French didn't have radios. No. The Charbis, I'm not sure if we call that superior. Simon Thompson. France made the same mistake in World War I and World War II. In World War I, the French pushed their forces into an area, Alsace-Lorraine, far from where the real fighting would take place. This meant the bulk of their forces were in the wrong place until the First Battle of the Marne. In World War II, the French moved the bulk of their forces into Belgium, and even the frickin' Netherlands, apparently. When the Germans got their breakthrough, the bulk of the French forces were on the north side of the German corridor that was closer to Paris. France, Gamelin, literally had no reserve after pushing the elite army out of France. The French arrogance was catastrophic. Algar, except the bulk of the French army was not in Belgium. The bulk of the French army was in France. Now, it is true that the best of the French army was in Belgium, including its armoured motorised units, but that is not the same as the bulk of the army. I'd say the bulk of the mobile army. The only army you could actually put anywhere to stop things. Stuart, if you don't like Maginot Line, the question on this then are, what would you like to have done built in its place? And two, what actually would have been built? A common wargame option is to reduce the line to a lower level of fortification and get a significant armoured force in its place. But would this actually have happened, or would you still get the same French army and just a few forts on the border? Probably that. Martin Borland, the question is probably, could French industry build tanks as well as it could build fortifications? If the answer is yes, then it becomes a political question of will. I suspect the answer was no, so the whole issue gets sent around the circle back to how do we stop the Germans? The answer is with massive forts and local mobile reserves. Stuart Wald, we know that they could build Charbis, which, if unwieldy, could certainly outslug any Panzer 1 or 2, or Czech tank. They were not, however, formed in large numbers into independent tank divisions with aggressive commanders. You just get a single unit formed under de Gaulle in 1940, and the entire French command strategy in Moenset was passive. Even absent Felgab, Gamelin was not planning to attack the Germans until 1941 at the earliest. Martin Mond, I was thinking more in terms of how many Char B or similar they could build. Arguably, as they could build the turrets X for the line, they may have been able to build sufficient tanks, but equally it was more of a civil engineering than a manufacturing task. As for waiting until 1941, that doesn't seem unreasonable. Wait until you have a truly overwhelming strength before attacking it. It's pretty logical. And the French, more than most, understood they were in an economic war, and that the home fleet had the Germans back where they had been in 1917-18. So, Sablasmore, your point about forests is a bit, well, oversimplified. The problem with a rapid advance over the forest mountains were not the trees. The problem were the bad few roads, and you're not going to hack a new road through the forest and broken ground. If you want to be in Sedan in 2 days after starting, and tanks can't drive over trees very well in practice, especially not Panzers 1 and 2, which were very numerous in German tank formations of that date. True, but honestly, I was doing what I could in 11 minutes to describe it, so allow me to, in a little bit longer, expand a bit more. And I think we're only on to part 2 of this one so far. Okay, so if I want to be in Sedan 2 days after starting, I'd want to widen the roads. And the thing is, the roads are windy through the forest east-west if I'm moving east-west. But I need to widen them to get things. But I need passing places. I need things which can get round obstacles. And that's the thing. If I have those systems, I can get trees out of the way if a vehicle breaks down and get them round. It can speed up my maneuver through there. And your point about stumps is true, but it depends how low you cut and if you're prepared to use explosives as well. Stephen Connery, agreed, it worked on three-ish occasions, in fact. Firstly, in 1940, demonstrated in terms of where Germans do not attack. Second-ish, in Madagascar. In Colin Smith's England's last war against France, fighting Vichy 1940-42, there was a defence line in Madagascar that held up Allied forces constructed it in similar principles to the Maginot Line. As the author puts it, the Joffre line was like a mini Maginot. It slows the Allied advance down, which obviously doesn't do much due to the lack of strategic support Vichy could offer, but the principle is thus demonstrated. The final occasion came during the Battle of the Bulge, Operation Nordwind, where portions of the Maginot Line are described by Stephen Ambrose as fulfilling their intended purpose. Admittedly, the Madagascar example is a bit of a stretch. England's last war against France is really a fun and fascinating read. Yeah, that it is. Carl Carton. Forests don't work, except they do. Tanks can go cross-country, but that increases wear and tear and fuel consumption. And if your infantry and artillery is in trucks, you need to stick to roads for anything but very short-range movements. You also need passing places for those trucks break down, so you'd better make the roads wider. In the Ardennes, probably for any movement because in short-range movements. In the Ardennes, probably for any movement because the area is not flat like the forest in England. It's very hilly. Forests in England are flat. Have you ever been to a forest in England? I don't think I've found a flat one. They're usually bumpy and lumpy, and quite a lot of them are hilly. In my area, there's one called Headley and one called Box Hill, and that's before we get into the area around the Surrey Oaks and all those sort of things. There are lots of hilly forests in England. In fact, as a rule, they tend to be very hilly, and the New Forest is quite hilly as well. Roads, on the other hand, were few and narrow. Plenty of steep and narrow valleys with many streams crossing roads, very few and narrow. True. Ideal terrain is to stop motorized attack. This equals ideal terrain to stop motorized attackers provided it's defended, which it wasn't. It was, they just didn't have the best divisions there, and the division commanders were definitely not the best. Despite knowing months in advance that the German invasion would come, Mechlin innocent, the Belgians did not coordinate the Allies. When the German attack came, a sizable French quick reaction force moved in to back up the Belgians, only to run headfirst into the Germans because the Belgians had simply abandoned the area. They fought as long as they could, which was longer than anyone estimated. All the area? No. In the small town of Madeleine-Bollange, a reinforced infantry company made a stand. They repulsed the German infantry, a second attack with tank support, and even a third supported by direct firing field artillery. Only four succeeded. By this time, more than 12 hours had passed, during which the best-equipped German armed divisions were pinned in place by topography and one company of infantry. Imagine if it had been a battalion. Andrew Cox, since you insist, nasty comment. The success of the Maginot Line is that the Germans were forced to go round it exactly as they were supposed to. That the French so completely messed up their pre-planned response to that is not the fault of the Maginot Line. Yes, but the Maginot Line, as I've said, it should have been to the coast, or it should have been at least to the Sambre. Lone Ranger V12. The French did not plan to trust the Belgians, but expected to be able to deploy in Belgium before any war started, when the Maginot Line was started. But then Belgian foreign policy changed massively afterwards, from pro-French to neutral. This was meant to be a solid line of forts from the Swiss border to the coast in Belgium, when the plan started. Even in 1940, before the invasion, the Belgians were telling the French that they had made defensive fortifications. In the nicest way, the French had spies. They knew exactly what was there. Making a hard-fought line along the Belgian border would have run counter the Allied attempts to get Belgians on the side before the war started. I think I answered that earlier. Just build fortifications everywhere around all your whole border and just say it's our policy. The Belgians can hardly complain if you're building fortifications opposite the Swiss. The French knew the Germans could get through the forest, but thought it would take a lot longer, and they would have to pause on the Meuse to organise an attack which would allow the French to reposition if that did happen. Which actually is what the Germans ordered to happen, but was ignored by the Panzer commanders. There was also lots of problems with no communication over who would cover the Ardennes and the Belgian covering forces in their retreat. Found any contest, bar one or two cases, in which in nearly all cases, because their high command ordered them to fall back. The French covering forces also deployed there too slowly. For some reason, the local commander ignored all the air recon reports and ordered no airstrikes. The push through the Ardennes could have been a massive disaster if a few small things had changed. I.e., if that solid red line extended all the way to the Sambre, at least, then even if when the Germans crossed the Meuse, they'd still have a long way to go. But good lord, that has been a full hour on that one. It's now got to a full hour, this discussion so far. That's been what? Ooh, about 38 minutes. And now we go on to the next, which is now. The comments to this are always cool. Now, let's go right down the bottom. Steve Windish. Normally, I am a bit against historical revisionism. It seems some channels on YouTube use myth-busting history as a rite of passage to become made amends somehow by going against established record to replace it with new paradigms. They're not always correct, or at least overblown for sensationalism and not even sometimes self-promotion. Not every fact in history is false, with the truth ignored or somehow suppressed. Please note, I do not count your channel or Drax among those that are all just a general rant. But this time, I need to point out the recent information about Napoleon being homicidal, psychopathic murderer of huge proportions should be brought out. What he ordered in Haiti was incredible, amazing in its sheer horror. Shades of Hitler. Unfortunately, the reason I didn't bring this out is, honestly, it doesn't have much to do with the invasion of Britain. I'm sorry, it doesn't. It's terrible. He's not nice, but in invasion of Britain terms, well, the fact that Napoleon is not nice is Napoleon's not nice. There's a reason Britain doesn't like him. So what did he do? He ordered the murder by gassing of over 200,000 Haitians. It's because he specifically stated that it was the most efficient method possible. He also stated that blacks were scientifically inferior. There were some strange people who thought that at the time, and even later, unfortunately. There are even some who walk amongst us these days who somehow believe that, and they are really deluded. Let me put it this way. My personal view, and this is my personal view, is you never judge a book by its colour. Or rather, a book by its cover. Or its colour. And you do that with humans as well as books, because honestly, humans are more complicated than books, as a rule. And so if all you judge a book by is what's on the outside, you're never going to find a good book. And if all you judge a human by is what's on the outside, you're never going to find a good human. They accomplished this gassing in the first decade of the 1800s by putting the captured revolutionaries into the holds of prison ships, then gassing them to death with sulfur, which they had collected from volcanoes as rocks, then burned to create poisonous sulfur dioxide gas. They were also killed by filling them with gunpowder and exploding them, tearing them to ribbons, and roasting them to death over slow fires. Beside these horrors, unusual other things abounded in tens of thousands by French troops, which were already well known and well documented behaviour in the occupation of Spain at the time. Napoleon ordered the death of every black in Haiti over the age of 12. Many of those youngsters were killed also, sometimes by being put into sandbags. Ouch. He reinstituted slavery specifically to bring new slaves to Haiti and other islands after it had earlier been banned 12 years before. There were many, many witnesses to all this, including accounts of French officers who refused to carry out these orders. There are also accounts of the skeletons of the dead in huge numbers still existing 20 years later. The Toussaint revolution was brutal on both sides, but the new evidence proves that the slaves had little choice but to revolt en masse for their own self-preservation, considering how hideous and brutal their treatment by Napoleonic French was. For example, they were forced to wear tin muzzles so they could not eat sugarcane they tended. Now, however, that's horrible. Now we shall have to cancel Napoleon. Nick Vodden, are there any good books about this part of Napoleon? I know some things like he reintroduced slavery, but not the Gatting thing. Distinguish, Matt here. Cancelling would be good, considering planned genocide and introduced murder is a little more horrible than inappropriate touching. I would argue one could lead to the other. Because anything which starts to make you think people are less than you and less deserving respect can lead to bad things. Respect everyone. Trust no one. Joke. Respect everyone. Trust but verify. Matt, distinguish in any war between the civilized man and the savage. Support the civilized man. No. History is cool, 889. Nah, never gonna happen. The French aren't into that stuff as much as the other Western countries. Even their president proved this. And Napoleon's too big in France. At the moment. Paragraph. I thought this would be about the crazy invasion of Russia, as opposed to the crazy invasion of Britain. Have you noticed, when crazy and conquering dictators think about invading Britain and discover they can't, they tend to vent their frustration on Russia. Which they also can't conquer, just for different reasons. I could make a joke about the European Union and Russia right now, but I'm not going to. Paragraph. Martello Towers can be seen at the Royal Military College in Kingston, Ontario. Yes, they can. They're cool. Nick Borden. Favorite battleships: Warspite, Queen Elizabeth class, Tegoff class, Vanguard, and Last Battleship Edition. Favorite battlecruisers: the Flinger and Renown. Thomas Ryder. French invading Britain. Well, they did land a force in Wales in 1797, which was a complete fiasco, and a larger force in Ireland the following year to aid the Irish uprising, which had some initial successes before defeating, and as the whole 1066 thing, which, let's be honest, is technically by Viking Norsemen, who settle in Normandy, or the Northmen's part of France. And so basically Vikings who learned how to ride horses and speak French. Nathan Hall, this topic gets my vote for an extended version. I think I'm going to consider that these long discussions are possibly the extended versions. We'll see how many people say they would like extended versions of which topic. Wayne Boren, I'm not sure if you classify them as dreadnought types, but the Finnish coastal defense ships, aka coastal battleships, were manufactured in the dreadnought era and designed to fight dreadnoughts. What do you think? If not, then I vote for HMCS Canada, since it isn't well known. In fact, I'm Canadian and I know a little about it. Cool. George Crabbe, favourite battleships: Warspite, King George V, USS North Carolina, USS New Jersey. Which King George V? Ryan's work on YouTube has made me a big fan. We are all big fans of USS New Jersey. Battlecruiser, HMS Renown and Nigerian Congo. We all would love Renown as well. Union Navy, even if Napoleon had landed and had taken London, I doubt he would have won. Hatred Britain would have had for the French would have been so white hot that nationality negotiation would have left the equation. It would have been very interesting. Jonathan Evans. Napoleon's invasion scheme appears well thought out, only when compared to Sea Lion. Compared to Sea Lion, it's a frickin' thesaurus. Jonathan Evans. HMS Warspite and HMS Hood. Dave Brent. If you don't want to bash the French, Drac has a free afternoon. Recently someone was asking Drac whether he and I could do a discussion of battlecruisers and basically dreadnought construction and nuances and different views on them. It could be interesting. But people have to start commenting if they want us to do it, because we sit down. We might even get Jamie into, how do I put this? Referee. Scipio Africanus. How viable is the continental system? If there was no war in Iberia nor defection of Russia, could Napoleon have eventually starved England's export economy and thereby ruined England? Now, I would not really, because the continental system, and this was the joke, was being broken all the time. The British were exporting to France, but also Britain were exporting elsewhere and importing from elsewhere, and lots of countries were not actually taking part in the so that's supposed to be part of the continental system. We're not enforcing control. I said including France. Yeah, there was trade still going on in France. It was smuggled, but trade quite vibrantly. And you have to remember the interconnected global system we have today was not quite replicated then. Actually, I'll say on the battlecruiser dreadnought battleship sort of thing. Cool way to do that would be to have a full list of questions coming from all of you that we could discuss, and Jamie could read the question and cross-examine us and keep us to topic, and we would have to discuss it and go by question as a sort of Build-Trump special. But let's see. We'll see what they want to do. What you want us to do. Martello Towers. I do love them. They're cool. And so, moving on to the next one. It's 1 hour 11 minutes. Good lord. It's turreted fighters, which was spiritably defended by a lot of you. I was not expecting so many of you to want to put up a defense of turreted fighters. And honestly, I'm not really sure why, but I should have realized it was coming. You are the people who love the Blackburn and are turning it into apparently a living legend, according to some people who emailed me the other day. Seneca, this series is amazing. Thank you. Hieroglyph, same story, different edition. Doctrinal uncertainty due to rapid technological advance and desire to refight the last war results in something which looks great on paper but fails in practice. Same thing with the German destroyer fighters. Cal Gassman, to defend the BF-1110 when it was decided upon as a type, it did have a higher top speed than the BF-109. Even the cursed Me-210 was a good twin-engine fighter, just a very demanding aircraft and a sly engine eliminator. By the time those unpleasant attributes were remedied, it became a pilot's aircraft around the Me-210C, A models, and later 410s. Hieroglyph, bad execution because no forward-firing cannons. Why cheap out on the forward-firing nose cannon, or even just a couple of wing-mounted machine guns? Bad doctrine, that's why. Joltel, blame the Air Ministry. Bolden Paul offered a variant with no turret and with either 12 303s or 4 20mm cannons and wings capable of 360 miles per hour at 23,500 feet in mid-1940. But they were turned down. They even modified one of the original prototypes as a demonstrator. Ooh, yeah, that was actually quite a good-looking aircraft. Hieroglyph, I don't think this actually was a problem, but I looked at the turret and asked myself, how long till a newbie gunner shoots off his own tails or either wing? Callum Gosmo, as soon as the fire-blocking circuits die or some smart guy overrides them. Hieroglyph, 1940s solenoids and wiring in combat, what could possibly go wrong? Callum Gosmo, things can go south. South Dakota. Yeah. Jay, the Happy Wyvern. I've always loved the look of the Defiant, to the point I might like it as much as the rest of the channel loves the Blackburn. Old Richard. Heretic! This is what has happened in my life. The Blackburn is now a religion, and apparently I started it, and I don't know how. Carl Gasmo, you are observed infidel. If YouTube is watching this, this is over a plane called the Blackburn. John South, you're not alone. As I stated in the earlier post, the P-94 variant of the Defiant was, in my opinion, a major lost opportunity. It was. Would have been cool to have in 1940, and wouldn't have been that difficult to produce. Lion High X-Ray. What about scout aircraft? I could see having an extra set of eyes being handy for scouting. Like most aircraft, it would be better with more power. Force A1. See Air Ministry Specification S936. There's some information on it in Norman Freeman's Fighters Over Fleets. Cool. Force A1. The US Navy's late 1940s post-war outline specification 112 were escort fighters for the bombers carried by the USS United States CVA-58 resulted in a brief rebirth of the turret fighters as a concept. And the F9F Panther was briefly tested with a turret. An F9F was briefly... I'm going to have to investigate that. If I manage to find a picture, there will be a short video produced about it. Chris Martin, the Fight was designed to go after bombers. I do not think the RAF ever thought that it would go up against fighters like the Bf-109 and 1110. It was a reasonable stopgap night fighter, as it turned out. It was the great-grandson of the Bristol fighter in concept. But the Bristol fighter was better. Down south, there was a proposed variant of the Defiant offered by Bob and Paul that ditched the turret and had weapons in the wings. We made a single prototype of the P-94 configuration, a modification of the original Defiant prototype K8310, and its speed was between that of the Spitfire and Hurricane at 360 miles per hour in 1940 at 23,000 feet, although production models were expected to get to 380 miles per hour at 23,500 feet, but with superior dive performance, mainly due to the weight differential and the more studied construction, as well as having significantly more armament. 12 303s or 420mm were both proposed, and it would have ended service in 1940-41. On top of this, due to its bigger size, it also had a far superior fuel tanks and a longer range than the contemporary Spitfire models. Although from the VB onwards, the Spitfire starts to outrange the Defiants ever built. P-94, while the leading turret, was still intended to have a two-person crew, the second acting as an observer, and it's possible that this version would have also been fitted with radar like the Defiant 2 was, and that second crew member would have been the primary radar operator like in a modern warplane. A semi-modern warplane. While cool, the ability to depress the guns in the wings by 12 degrees for better ground strafing probably would have been ditched to make the production easier, cheaper, and also to save weight, and help with maintenance and performance. But I can only imagine what a plane with the firepower of a Spitfire VC, but with a much more forgiving wing undercarriage, and that would have been able to suitable for the desert and other hastily prepared airstrips, but also carriers as well as having airborne interceptor radar that the Defiant 2 received in late 1940 could have achieved in 1941-42. Unfortunately, the Air Ministry turned it down as they believed current production of Spitfires and Hurricanes was sufficient for UK needs, and they were resistant to having another fighter on the production block. It's a great pity, as the rejected proposal for the Defiant had immense potential, arguably more than the Spitfire due to its more generous airframe, and in 1941 could have given the UK a plane capable of escorting bombers with competitive performance, thus saving the lives of countless bomber pilots, and really helped the war effort in general. The British did sort of shift to night flying, so they didn't really need it as much, but it would have been useful. I think the Air Ministry's rejection of P-94, while understandable in the immediate situation of August 1940, was a short-sighted disaster. With Bolton and Paul's relationship with the RN, though, through their long association of supplying parts and excess production capability to both Blackburn and Fairey, and the FAA's desperate need for a modern fighter with two seats, I could easily imagine a version of the P-94 Defiant being the main FAA fighter of 1941 onwards, and not the Fulmar, which was a derivative of the Fairey P-434 light bomber, which itself was a descendant of the Fairey Battle light bomber. They look similar, but to be honest, actually, it's a descendant of the concept prior to the Fairey Battle light bomber, so it's sort of... how do I put this? It's not a grandchild, it's more a nephew or niece. Even the turret, the Defiant was 2,000 pounds lighter than the Fulmar, and it's perfectly plausible that the Fulmar, though, you have to remember, is fitted for naval operations. The Defiant, once it had been fitted for naval operations, might well have been heavier as well, because there things were being added in. The arrestor gear, etc. And it's perfectly plausible that even with the new wings and tail hook and reinforced landing gear assembly, the navalised version of P-94 could have been smaller and lighter than the Fulmar, at roughly halfway between the size of the Fulmar and a Spitfire Seafire. It also allowed for more ease in handling for carrier crews, whilst providing a plane durability, straight line speed, and dive performance, as well as immense firepower to definitely give the Japanese Zero a really bad day. So we're talking of a plane performance not too far off that of late war Fairey Firefly, but 2 to 3 years earlier. When I look at the list of crazy decisions by the air industry made during World War II, I seriously wonder whose side they're actually on, and every one of them could probably have a good shout at being awarded the Iron Cross. You always have to remember they're making decisions the best they can at the time with no hindsight. But also they are a bit nutty. I do admit they are a bit nutty sometimes. Again, really enjoying the series, both for the brevity and the subject matter. Thank you. Single Freedom 114. Great series. I see the crackpot scheme or good idea, badly done situation so often in product design. We all do. It's quite disturbing how often it still turns up. Come guys, so as soon as sufficient engine power was available, and both the Yanks and the Krauts got the idea not to put Tailgun Charlie into the turret, but separately have the remote turrets and the gunner and the optics, the P-61 and ME-410 became reasonably successful, as well as a few attack light bomber craft with remote turrets pressed into night fighter service. Dev Squad. The P-61 is a bad example of the dorsal as the dorsal turret was almost always used by being flexed forward and linked to the pilot's trigger. It's also often removed, with the nose-mounted quad 20mm being deemed more than adequate for shooting down any target. That's why I didn't put it up here on the screen. Come on, guys. Honourable mention goes to the early successes of the PB Defiant. It took a few measurements to figure out the weak spots of the Defiant and make it being possible to make some formation tactics to prolong useful. It would have been possible to make some formation tactics to prolong the usefulness of the Defiant as a fighter. As Piton PC. From what I remember reading, it did decent work against bombers during the Blitz, especially at night. I'm sure it did. Shirani 19. According to this website, one of the key design reasons behind turret fighters was no allowance of shooting. The Defiant in particular could lock its turret in a forward position and be fired by the pilot in a similar way to the German Schranzmusic, apparently. Interesting. Paul Saban. If you want to talk about twin-engine turret fighters, they're always the Bolton Paul P9. They're always the Bolton Paul P92. It had a full 20mm spanners as well. Yeah, that was interesting. Tom Bevel. Back in 2000, I had the pleasure of meeting a Defiant pilot at RAF Museum Duxford. That's Imperial War Museum Duxford, not RAF Museum Duxford. I know it's an air museum, but it's not one of the RAF museums. It's one of the IWM's ones. And the reason I make that important point is it changes its funding structure and its organisation. There are RAF museums, there are Imperial War museums. So it's like Portsmouth is a historic dockyard, and Yeovilton are part of the naval museums. Hendon and a couple others, there are RAF museums. There is the IWM London, there is HMS Belfast, there is Duxford, and there are other sites which are Imperial War museums. So some are technically tri-service. It was very much the English gentleman, and with eyebrows that could have taken flight. We talked about Defiant as a night fighter and using turreted guns like the Forerunners of the jazz music setup. He was quite surprised to mention he had also some interesting recollections of Douglas Bader being a bit difficult, including that every day he would call upon Squadron Aggie to serve as his golf caddy. Honestly, as senior officers go, that's not that problematic. While the twin-engine planes may have had the power to make a turreted fighter viable, when considering power-to-weight ratio, turreted fighter was still a question of concept at best. Even then, the P-61 was initially viewed as too slow to be of use in European theatre. As it struggled to catch the medium bombers it was intended to shoot down. This was rectified by turning the engines to a higher power output, but at the most, the cost of the increased maintenance requirements over the expected levels. For a turret fighter to be effective, the pilot needs to fly straight and level to allow the turret gunner to be able to aim at all accurately. This wasn't so much of an issue with engaging unescorted bombers at night, as the turreted fighter could approach unseen. However, as day fighter intercepted the pilot flying to trying to avoid getting the plane shut down would mean the gunner wouldn't be able to aim in any way reliably. Dr. Clark's mention of P-61 Black Widow in support of the concept of turret fighter is questionable. The turret was able to be fixed forward and slaved to the pilots with weapons control, along with the 420mm cannon in the nose. This was how it was used in the vast majority of cases with the gunner being either left out of the crew or being used to rotate the position with the radar operator. In many cases, the turret was removed to save weight and drag, the nose-mounted 20mm cannon being deemed more than adequate for shooting down any target. Andrew Cox, there was a prototype turreted bowfighter, built and tested, but the drag was too much. Likewise, yes, the 20mm would have been better with hindsight, but it's worth remembering that the RF considered the 303 adequate until they realised how many rounds of 303 it took to knock down a medium bomber, and how few rounds you could put on a target in one pass. Another advantage of turreted fighter against bombers was that they could put more rounds on target each pass. Theoretically, but I do often wonder what would have happened if the cannon-armed fighters had been what the British had been able to field in 1939 and 1940. It might have been a very interesting effect. Because they were trying to field them. Jonathan, one issue is like the skewer. They come in a time where a delay of entering service can mean the difference between seeming a world beater and being obsolete. Was the train rate on the turret sufficient for the speed of air-to-air combat? Defiant assumed that the Germans would be out of the range of their fighter escorts flying from home soil, so had the RAF used them like the gladiators in Battle of Britain, holding defence of locations outside the range of Bf-109s to free up Hurricane Spitfire squadrons, they would have been useful as bomber destroyers. I think one issue to Defiant was over-reporting by multiple gunners, knocking out an insane target whilst without realising, and the figures made them seem more viable than they were. See, Winnish. I always had a feeling they never actually asked the fighter pilot if it was a good idea or not. Perhaps the other nations were building fighters did. Britain wasn't the only country that did pursue these. Jonathan Evans, is the battlecruiser a Crackpot scheme? If so, who's there's an argument to be had that the Invincibles really are still armoured cruisers, just that the 9.2-inch needed escalating as the 50 cal had been disappointing, and that developing a gun in the 10 to 11-inch range didn't offer enough advantage over the simplicity of just using the existing 12-inch weapon, especially as new caliber would not be required by the battleships. Battlecruiser is a Crackpot scheme. I think I've covered battlecruisers concepts before. It's not really a Crackpot scheme, just a logical continuation. And as I've said recently, I think it honestly would have been amazing if they'd been called frigates rather than battlecruisers. That was considered, I think, as I understand it from my reading of history, and it would be highly interesting if they had been called that. Paul from Chicago. With respect, anyone who has shot Skeet knows how crackpot the scheme was. Bill Bond, Wellington as a night fighter. Rate of climb speed, good luck with the execution of that scheme. The Germans repurposed bombers as night fighters to some success. Yes, but just think of the size of radar you could fit on the Wellington, combined with the cannoned turrets you could have fitted on them. That would have been interesting. It would have been really interesting. And now, I think we're on to cruiser submarines. Now, a lot of comments on this one. Seneganeer, isn't that what a modern nuclear submarine is? Not really. Although to an extent it is, but they don't carry that as enough torpedoes really to be what we call a cruiser submarine. I would say a cruiser submarine would have to cover a lot more reloads to be in modern terms of a nuclear submarine, especially for their weight. Right, there's a really long thread of discussion which starts off with a hieroglyph here. The problem with any very large submarine is that diving time is significantly longer, thus significantly reducing their survivability. The problem with employing 8-inch cannons on a submarine, are: 1. Targeting is very difficult. It's not that high up. 2. The submarine is more vulnerable due to fighting on the surface, and the hull can't stand that much for any impacts. And however, running a float plane from submarines is both possible and sensible in the 1940s. Surkoff was only more extremely bad as compared to the Romeo-class Italian submarines, which were not that much worse than Type 9. Many Type 9s were converted to mine-laying and freighting because their long diving time made them much less viable than Type 7s. The Surkoff was the worst of the crackpot idea. You want your submarines to be small and fast diving, which of course reduces its range and torpedo complement. So you also need transports of some sort, surface or submarine, to rearm and refuel them. It helps a lot if your cryptography isn't compromised. Nick Vaughan, the only Type 9 boats that were converted into freight submarines were the 2 boats of the 9D1 type. The boat that boat had a different engine arrangement, 6 diesel motors and 2 electrical motors were before conversion, than the other Type 9 boats. 2 diesel boats and diesel and 2 electrical motors. Their fuel tanks could hold 203 tons. The previous 9 C40 type could hold 214. The following Type 9D2, 442. The only category where these boats are improvement on is the surface speed of 20.8 knots. 15.8 knots after conversion. Data from Eric Gollner. Die Schiff der Deutschen Kriegsmarine und Luftwaffe of 1939 to 1945. The ships of the German Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe, 1939 to 45. Do you have sources of similar conversion of similar? Do you have sources for similar conversions of example Type 9A boats? Conversions for mine laying wasn't a thing for any Type 9 boat, at least isn't described in Groner's book, but maybe you can present sources for it. Nick Vaughan, 10 Type 14 milk bots were completed, not 2. All were sunk as highest priority targets and converted from 9s. Hieroglyph. Regarding the 9C, I was inaccurate, though on paper designed for torpedoes as 9AB, these were turned into mine layers on the slipwave. I don't believe any were commissioned as 9AB and then converted into 9C. Nick Vaughan. Type 9A boats were built, but it seems they were used for non-frontline duties, i.e. no ship sinking missions from the middle of the war to the end. Since there were only a few boats of Type 9, I would assume training of new Type 9 crews, or maybe for familiarizing fresh sailors from basic training with subs. Type 9Bs were normal frontline boats. A paper design was the Type 10 mine-laying submarine, and there were designs for a cruiser, as in heavy gun-armored cruiser sub before the war. The Milkov are based on a Type 9 design, but they are more cousins than brothers. Move on. I have to correct one thing. The Type 10 had never built A variant and a smaller B variant, which was built. The design cruiser I referred to was called the Type 11. Ben Wilson. Launching and recovering onto a submarine would be a nightmare. Submarines roll. It is. Nick Vaughan. I don't know what you want to launch from a sub or resume aircraft. It was done by the Japanese. So it might be complex, but it is possible. That's true. Complex, but possible. And still not fun. Rapid Razorback. I feel like carrier subs would fit here too. New IQB 472. Use a couple of I-400 class subs to strip all the escorts off a convoy. Then send in the Surkoffs and X-1 class boats, all gun blazing. Use one of the attack aircraft as a spotting plane for the gun arm boats before it RTVs back to the I-400. Maybe have a command milk cow sub for every 2 or 3 such wolf packs, basically an I-400, but with most of the torpedoes removed for spare aircraft parts and 1 or 2 aircraft in the hangar, using the rest of the space for command and control facilities. Might also be worth having an aircraft as a communications plane with the biggest radio transmitter it can carry, pre-recording your reports back to base, and have the comms plane fly as far away as possible and then transmit the message. Would make radio direction finding much harder, less useful, as the search radius just got to 50 to 100 miles bigger if you want to find submarines, not just the comms aircraft. Lovely ideas on paper. Actually putting them into practice, very difficult. In the 1930s and 40s. Jim Heen, madness. The big gunner is not a sub that can cruise in terms of long range. See on their glass cannon. John South, if they have radar-guided gunnery systems, would a cruiser sub be more valuable as a surface search radar backed up but with fire directors? This could solve the issue of range and having to close in too much to be a risk from escort vessels. Eldamora, no. 1. The radar will not have sufficient range, since the surface sub is very low on water. 2. Radar is a complex electronic device. How well would it resist submerge? Ben Wilson. And Henry Moore, thank you, logic at its best. True. John South. Ben Wilson, unfortunately, is factually wrong, as 1940s radar tech was up to it, and used on submarines with SJ and SV radar sets being ideal for the job. Please see my early response to Helder. Yes and no. They're up to the job, but the range they can give you isn't that great. Not enough to really outright. It's going to sound strange. As we talked about before when talking about the curvature of the Earth and radar range, the higher you are, the further you can see around the Earth. So the higher your shortest range distance becomes. Unless you could have it on some sort of telescopic mast which would take it very high up relative to the submarine. It's not really going to help that much versus a surface destroyer with its own centimetric radar. John South, let's Donald South, let's assume you're correct regarding radar and fire turret. Accuracy. A surfaced sub is an inferior stable gunnery platform because of the surface wave action. 2. Rate of fire, the number of gun barrels and loading times of cramped sub versus a surface ship. 3. Armor battle sub damage. A sub is not as protected as a surface ship. Even an indirect hit will seriously damage a sub. 4. Enemy. Enemy surface ships will try to close in and engage the sub with all their weapons. 5. Aircraft. Against aircraft, the gun cruiser sub is more vulnerable because it takes more time to dive, even a crash dive. 6. Maintenance. Electronics, radar plus fire control. Hate saltwater environments, and a World War II sub is even worse. Conclusion. A gun cruiser sub is of very limited use. Ben Wilson. John South. Unfortunately, the thing you cannot increase is the height of the radar scanner. Therefore, the distance the radar will see is limited. The other factor is a submarine is a stealth ship, in that it is used as surprise. You use radar, and suddenly you're not stealthy, and aircraft can see you at long distance. John South. Ben Wilson. Actually, you can increase the height of radar scanner. Most radars and modern subs have their surface search radar on telescopic poles. That's what I was talking about. So you can literally do that. You can even use them while you're underwater. I spent 5 years in the Navy and started radar operator. The biggest telescopic pole I've ever used was about 30 foot tall and about 3 to 4 inches in diameter at its widest part. Modern submarines have both active and passive surface search radar on telescopic poles. Although, just like a periscope, you have to be careful when you use it. You can buy pole-mounted radars here, although this particular one isn't telescopic. That just costs extra. John South to Helmura. One of the things you have to remember is that up until near the end of World War II, the primary weapon of a submarine was its deck gun, not its torpedo. Hence, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say it's by the end of World War II. That's near the end of World War II. I would say it's well before the end of World War II. I think you're talking by 1941, if not earlier. Especially if you're talking about Allied submarines. They're getting very focused on their torpedoes. And to be honest, the Germans are as well, because once you've got enough surface escorts coming through and you've got escorts sitting inside the convoy if using your guns, you're not going to use your guns. Against only if you find a lone enemy ship, a lone enemy merchant ship, will you use your guns. And honestly, the Germans were very distrustful of lone enemy ships because they thought they might be Q ships. It was advanced in escort technology that forced submarines to engage more often in underwater attacks, and led to removal of deck guns and major changes to submarine ships to get a good view of this compared to hull forms of the Type 9 and Type to compare the hull forms of the Type 9 and the Type 21 submarine. While a submarine did have a reduced rate of fire compared to a normal ship-mounted gun, it was still multiple rounds a minute, and by having a larger caliber gun and longer range, you can mitigate this with a good crew and test the Surkoff averaged about 2 to 3 rounds a minute, with its two 8-inch guns at the distance that could easily sink an escort before it came in range to reply if you had a good fire control system. Yes, 2 to 3 rounds. 2 to 3 rounds a minute. So let's say it's getting to 2 to 3 rounds a minute from each gun. So let's be generous and say it's getting 6 rounds out a minute. Cute. If you're talking about a tribal class destroyer, let's say not something you wouldn't expect for a cruiser to come across. That's 6 rounds a minute per gun. It's got 8 of them. So let's say you fire your first shot. Are you going to be lucky to get a first round hit with your salvo? Maybe you struggle, maybe you don't. But then you have to correct and fire again. And then correct and fire again. That's how you do it. In that time, she's going to be closing range. Her engagement range is probably going to be roughly the same as yours. Because if you're talking about time when you have radar, they probably have radar. In which case, they might have seen you on the surface a long while before them. And that's if you're hoping if they're just relying on radar and not firing their torpedoes at you on the surface. But she's got 8 guns, firing 6 rounds a minute, and I'm using the highest rate of fire for the Surkov and the lowest rate of fire for the Tribal. That's 48 rounds in the air. That's 6 salvos in the air. In time, you have 3 salvos. Your salvos have 2 shells, theirs have 8. 1 shell from either side is probably going to decide the fate. So they have 48 chances to cause you damage. You have 6 to cause them. And let's say, okay, you do start from out their range, but how long does it take to close down? And they're going to be zigzagging, maneuvering, and you've got to deal with that coming in towards you, and what are you going to do? And, oh, by the way, it's a convoy escort, so is there one of them? Are they calling in friends? And how much easier to replace that destroyer than it is to replace you? The Surkov, as well as having 2 8-inch guns, also carried 10 torpedo tubes with 6 of them on a swivel mount, allowing for 270-degree arc of fire similar to a contemporary destroyer. Yeah. This high-caliber gun and longer range also is its main defense against escorts, as if given good fire control systems, it could expect it to score hits at 10 to 15 plus kilometers. I'm sorry, but the 4.5-inch, then the 4.7s can reach out pretty much that far with the accuracy of the destroyer and the stability of that gun platform, which is far more than the submarines, which rocks far more. And he's done a huge long thing. Now, he's talking about Flower class corvettes, of course, but there are dozens of those. And again, you would not be engaging a single ship. Plus, any convoy doesn't just include Flower class corvettes. And this is the point. Yes, the Flower class corvettes, but you also find some fleet destroyers tucked in there. You might even find a cruiser. On occasion, those are quite big, powerful cruisers. So let's say she comes across a Crown Colony class or a Town class cruiser with 12 6-inch guns. Again, each capable of firing 6 rounds a minute. Each of those guns. So we're talking 72 rounds heading in. The only problem for a cruiser submarine is cruisers. There are a lot more of them. Oh, goodness help her if she comes across a convoy which has an R-class battleship or anything like that nearby. Yes, we have a mighty 8-inch gun. We're on the surface for too long. There's a 15-inch one pointing in our way. It's just not good. John South does a lot of very complicated, very interesting stuff. And there's a lot of detail on the submarines, but I think the trouble is there is stuff as it should technically work on paper, and there is the reality of it. And I think one of the problems is if you've worked in submarines these days, you're used to the technology which is several generations beyond what was being used in World War I or II, and the reliability of it. Sometimes I'm pretty sure most merchant ships were sunk by U-boats using Dex guns in World War I, so why not a huge deck gun? Well, as Nick Vorderman points out, storage for ammunition and overkill against merchants. That's the big problem. As I keep saying, a 4-inch gun would probably have been fine. Vision. The V-boat cruiser subs USS Narwhal and USS Nautilus had successful World War II careers. Pacific. The other interwar V-boats, while not great successes, did provide experience in design and operation and made US fleet subs very successful World War II. Yeah. Tony Scalaro. How does Nautilus, Narwhal, and Argonaut with 2 6-inch guns fit into cruiser submarine discussion? Annoying. Frederick Vega. Hello, Doctor. I'm enjoying this series. What's the perfect name? I'm glad. Get back to the 6-inch guns. It's edging there. They're still a bit big, but don't think you can take on an escort. This is the point I'm making. And honestly, if you're fighting a target that needs a 6-inch gun to deal with, you probably shouldn't be fighting that target if you're in a submarine. Tim McCarthy, just another totally excellent series. Thank you. I'm enjoying it as well. From George Graham. Thank you. An interesting concept, but 2 8-inch guns weren't much use. Too much for merchant ships and not enough for cruisers and above. A single deck-mounted conventional 5-inch gun would have sufficed. Not only did it carry a float plane, but also 1 or 2 motorboats. It served as a convoy escort, which seems a reasonable use for it, so to cruise the sub wasn't a brilliant idea. The French ended up with a sub could use excellent long range and speed, but lumbered with a heavy unnecessary gun turret. Iron X-ray and saw X Surkoff and couldn't click play any faster. Thank you. Najud. Sir, informative danke. Hail Alexander. Thank you. I think so. Thank you. Danke for the thing. Andrew Cox, HMS Incomparable. I think that's a suggestion for battleships and discussions. Dr. Trifonius, question. Did anyone ever consider developing a smaller than standard torpedo so raiding subs could carry more reloads? This was an interesting point. Carl Gasman raised it. Yes, the Italians carried a few 450mm torps with an adapter in their 33mm tubes, both due to torpedo shortage and to have more shots against smaller mid targets. Yeah. Which is rather sensible. William Cox. The Gerda course is the purpose of any naval war. For this, the cruiser submarine is a raider of the first order, until the deployment of long-range maritime patrol aircraft in large numbers. In World War II, UK-British convoys were sufficiently prepared to deal with enemy ships intending to fight their way against a convoy from the air surface. 2. That free specifically caused problems for the surface attack raider. Consider the cruiser submarine, as in the Regio-Marinas Cagney or the Kriegsmarines Type 11B, not built, used as solo raiders in the ocean during the September 1939 to April 1942 period. Additionally, imagine a wolf pack of Cagneys or Type 11B submarines instead of the same number of Type 7 boats in the distant oceans campaigning areas during 1941-42. Those are bigger boats with longer endurance, both in terms of fuel weapons. Since crossing the Bay of Biscay was the real bottleneck of death for outward-bound U-boats. there's an argument to be made in favour of sending bigger, longer endurance boats. Those that get through would have proportionally greater effect. Notes. Sink enough enemy merchant ships and his insurance rate make continuation of sea travel and transport untenable, unless the government steps in to act as guarantor of the insurance. And they will do. Pekin 17 notwithstanding. 3. That tactic of deploying distant escort groups with carrying cruisers, an occasional World War I battleship revamped. Once a convoy had dependable air assets, it was a whole nother level, as I said in the 90s. Surface submarine could be a serious disadvantage. This is a point the Royal Navy understood, and another reason which goes to why the Royal Navy should have been allowed to continue its carrier construction program in 1939-1940 without Churchill making that particular decision. Savage Dawson, thank you. Another great video. I'm sure they're mentioned. Iron Duke, Warspite, Hood, Renown, Ramillies. I would make the argument that with Dreadnought rolling out the Admiral class of the 1890s, 1900s would be considered battle cruisers. Hope school's gone well. The students were good, and they survived. I did as well. Casey Limbert. On the surface, it seemed like a good idea, but as you dive deeper into it, maybe not so much. That's actually quite a good submarine joke. How about Bob? Once a small hole is poked in it at an unfortunate location, it remains a very badly armored cruiser with a few defense possibilities. Yep. Thank you, Doug M. Dave, as a concept, we have a submarine cruisers today. They're called SSGNs or SSGNs. Some of the early ones even had the surface launch their missiles, just like these ones had to be used up their guns. Basically, they developed the platform before the appropriate weapon. I would argue that is what I would say is it, actually. SSGNs would be the closest to a cruiser submarine. In capabilities is what was aimed for. Remember, the trouble with good ideas is sometimes that's all they are, ideas. Ben Wilson, thank you for reminding patrons about your height of eye being important. So many think at the top of a cliff, while in reality, our submarine, you're standing atop a large sandcastle at the beach. Pretty much. Jonathan, I guess an issue of a cruiser submarine in the 1920s is that the vision is so limited compared to light cruiser with a float plane. Carl Gasford, even a 37mm, i.e. roughly 2-pounder pop gun on Austro-Hungarian tiny subs proved effective to stop ships. Now, by World War II, most commerce vessels, growing bigger, carried a serious battery. They were fitted with 4 inches and 3 inches from weapons from World War I, quite a lot, refitted, and some ACAC in the case of loaded ships. So having a turret on the sub to protect the gun crew from light guns on prey might be a good idea. Really? You're going to fit any turret which is going to protect from a 4-inch or 3-inch gun? Well, in the nicest way, if you do, that's great, but is your hull going to be protected against the cannon fire? A turret might even be a good streamlining for a deck gun to underwater protection against whoever on the surface act. 8-inch guns, however, are compensating for something. Autumn Yule Nashoba. Great idea for a treaty cheat, but bad timing. Subhashi Punjari. What does it take to build an academic career like yours, and what would you advise a prospective candidate like me? Stubbornness. You keep going. There are going to be lots of people who tell you not to. There are going to be lots of people who tell you to give up. There are going to be lots of issues that are going to have to keep going through. You are dealing with a never-ending stream of paperwork and people who don't always agree with you. Just keep going and email me through Discord. The link's down below, and I'm happy to help in whatever way I can. Because that's the only way you make it through in the end, by helping each other. As to Crow, submissions for favourite battleship, Dreadnought, battlecruiser. Pure Madness, HMS Agincourt, 1913. The ultimate example of, I'm going to carry every gun, I cram every gun I can on this thing. And for ridiculous examples of sending a full broadside downrange, and everyone else thinking she'd blown up until she comes happily steaming out of the giant cloud of gunsmoke she just made. Also pleasant to serve in, by what I can find of reports, so not only insanely armed, but very well appointed on the inside. The battlecruiser, Dunkirk class. I think I've covered this before. Yes, call a fast battleship, but the function was to hunt down cruisers and run away from battleships, so that's close enough. There's something just aesthetically pleasing about the quad. Double twin turrets and all forward main battery. Favorite battleship, Littorio class. Big, handsome, great lines, and pinnacle of optical fire control. Bonus mention for favourites never made it off the drawing board. The Amagi and the Kiri class. Thank you, Alistair. Glenn McGilvery. Big gun, long range, no protection. What would the Germans think of artillery raining on them from over the horizon from a few artillery submarines who have a low profile and can use spotters aboard destroyers off the coast or spotting aircraft to call on the range of shot? So with a bigger gun and a careful design ready to submerge quickly, you could shell land fortifications to impunity and leave at will without air threats. Nifty. It would never work that nicely, but you could dream. Steam winch. Before its time, can't imagine a good idea for that. Maybe. In 1945, the Sea of Japan, where the Gatos and Ballos had controlled the area, put something bigger on them and then have them bombard ports. Not especially efficient or effective usage, just something to do besides shoot up sampans and pick up down pilots. I think they did replace some smaller guns with 5-inch. Most people don't realise that the pressure hulls were not especially shell resistant. A 4-inch could easily hold them, so could a 3 or even 40mm. So fighting it out on the surface, not a good idea for a sub. The idea of a deck gun is to save the torp use with a poorly armed and badly gunnery trained merchants who usually don't have a chance of hitting anything so small their gun. Against any warship, never try to fight it out if there is any choice. In fact, the first action in the Pacific, USS Ward, a Wicks-class 4-stacker, sank a Japanese mini-sub with only a few shots. If she had caught the mothership eyebowed on surface, she would have sunk that as well, as any DD versus a surface or a sub battle would work out, whether the sub carried 4 or 10-inch guns, because with the larger caliber guns, the refire rate of the sub would be absurdly slow compared to the DD, which usually had fire control. Subs roll and pitch horribly on the surface. Hitting a moving ship in any kind of seas over 4 foot would be luck. That's the thing. This picture is deceptive because that's very, very calm water, she said. Very calm water. You're not normally in that calm of water. And now we get into steam rams, the last one for this video, as the Battle Atlantic will be their own separate video. Now, if you notice, what I'm doing is I'm making sure I'm saving this so I can put in there, down in the description, links to each section so you know where each section begins. Right then. Hieroglyphs. Steam rams. What is this, a Greek buffet? I think it now technically is the 15th behind me. Bichon. Ramming didn't even work even in the US Civil War. At Hampton Roads, the CSS Virginia almost sank ramming the Cumberland, and she set Congress afire with gunnery. In other battles like Mobile Bay, ships bumped into each other, but no ramming sank a vessel. The USN defeated the Confederate ironclads with gunnery. The 15-inch smoothbore Dahlgren, firing a solid shot with a big powder charge, could bash through the laminate armor and thick wood backing of the southern casement ironclads. For example, how the CSS Atlanta was quickly dispatched by one Union monitor at Savannah. So naval essence of the American conflict was thick armor and big guns in a reasonably maneuverable and well-built ship. No special effort needed for ramming. Stuart Ward. You could get different results in a restricted environment like the Mississippi River, such as the Memphis, where Ellet's armored rams were highly effective after Confederate rams had mauled the Union ships in the previous encounter. Vision. Stuart Ward. About the only successful example from the war, I would argue. I think immaturity of technology and tactics play a part in the Mad Max battle and the United States Ram fleet. Otako Luki. I really don't wish to dunk on Admiral Trion, nor the crews of HMS Victoria, nor HMS Canton, and what happened to those ships was not in battle, although I have done a discussion of it. So firepower is taken out of the equation too. Having said that, it seems like if it were that easy to avoid a ram, that collision should have been able to be avoided. Not to disagree with your general thesis, I have no trouble relegating the ram to Crackpot scheme. I just sort of struck by one portion of the argument. I want to see whether I could spark further commentary from you. Vision. An issue with Victorian Camadam was no one willing to go against the orders of the flag officer, who seems to have zoned out during the manoeuvring. Admiral Lord Horatio Descoing from Kind Hearts and Coronets. Not really. He's, as I've said, I think he was testing his crew in that one. He was testing people and trying to train them. Loaded dice. Steam rams? It's a regional dialect. Yankee Clipper. I'm from Utica, and I've never heard anyone use the phrase steam rams to describe ironclads. Well, there are ironclads, and there are ironclads built as rams. So, if they're built with ram as their principal weapon, or theoretically their principal weapon, I call them steam rams. They run. I can't wait until the war machines of Mars are covered. Resurrect the what? Vision. HMS Thunderchild from H.G. Wells' War of Worlds. About a couple of miles out lay an ironclad, very low water, almost to my brother's perception, like a waterlogged ship. This was the ram Thunderchild. Oh, Richard. Admiralty. Ramming doesn't work. HMS Dreadnought. Hold my beer. Well, if you're ramming a submarine. Billboard. If you're going to make a steam ram, go to whole hog. Get rid of your main guns, put on loads of frontal armor, slope your armor, increase engine power, maybe consider a spar torpedo, crew with only the suicidally brave. Yeah, it works for me. Simon Thompson. Learned something new today. I always wondered why more turrets were not placed super far in the center line. I also wondered about the blast effects for those forward of the wing turrets if they're firing at an enemy dead ahead. The blast effects have a lot of damage. I think I covered this in the review of the battle, Lisa. There are lots of impacts on it, and basically the idea is you would all be forward. You would have as many guns firing forward as possible. Seb Thompson, another good video, Doctor. I would contest, though, there was a time and place for RAM in both maritime policy, fisheries protection, and prior to open conflict. As hostilities increase, having an alternative to aiming a main gun or painting a target would be a benefit. To that end, having a hull form that could be capped, short or long term, with a reinforced section to act as a ram would be greater flexibility to respond to threats presented upon the ships and crew. You mentioned focused on once conflict had begun, but the time leading up to it could be as effective as a deterrent as winning conflict in the end. By demonstrating resolve to stay the course, when a rival vessel trying to intercept in several damage for their actions, and would spread quickly that old games don't work anymore. Keep up the great work. Hope school's gone well, and the family are holding up while you're on leave. Take care and best wishes always, Doctor. Oh, thank you, Stafford. Our family did hold up well, though I came back to a massive list of things need to be done. As for the rest, this is why I think more navies should be investing in icebreakers, because if you want a ship that's perfect for ramming, build an icebreaker. Glenn McGilvery. Rams and ramming happen in a couple of periods, fairly short ones. They built up armor proof to the weapons that the foe possessed, and then the ram is the most dangerous weapon in infantry. Guns might hurt crew, but the ship is proof. Of course, in both major ramming conflicts, the American Civil War and the conflict of the Austrian pre-dreadnoughts, guns to defeat their armor already existed, just not in the inventory of the forces actually engaging in conflict. Thus, the second-rate navies simply built their ships to protect against superior forces, but forgot to add weapons to inflict damage onto similar ships. Whoops. It happens. See, I guess the point would be using ramming as a tactic doubles the probability of getting the job done, in their minds anyway. Sort of a secondary backup for gunnery. But those who consider the ramming as the primary would be disappointed more often than not. I can also see it sort of attractive from a gallantry point of view, being so aggressive and brave and all that. Maybe it was a weird kind of Freudian thing that appealed to repressed Victorian males. Potentially. Ricardo Kowalski, hello. Why steam rams? Steam rams are like the spoilers on a Toyota Corolla. Someone thought they were cool, and nobody in the shipyard wanted to tell them otherwise. No, they didn't, but they did want to charge them for them. Anyway, thank you, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed these videos. This is going to be the longest, at about 124 minutes, possibly 125 minutes. I hope you found them interesting. There will be another one produced on the Battle Atlantics to look at those ones, but that'll be produced later this week. Well, next week, as it is. And yeah, when this comes out, there will be a live later in the evening from 6. So take care. See you then. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being patrons. Thank you for subscribing to the channel. Thank you for joining the channel. Thank you for everything you've done. You all do in your own ways to support it. Even if you're just watching, that's supporting the channel, in my opinion, because that's great. And thank you to everyone who shares it on social media and all those things. It's really nice. It's really cool. It's going to sound strange when I'm having a tough day with whatever I'm dealing with. If I suddenly get beeped at that someone shared one of my videos on Twitter or Facebook or something like that, it's a little pickup, you know? It's nice. Thank you. And take care. Anything else? Not really. But thank you again. Thank you.